Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? This is a background that I have not used before, but it is very convenient. I don't know. What do people think of this lovely background here? What do people think? What do people think? You like the background? Is it exciting? We got lights overhead. We've got studio behind me and glass. People like it? You like it? I like it. I think it's nice. But yeah. This is the background I'm using. Different place than normal. I probably won't be able to do very many lives from this location. But it's a slow afternoon, not too many people at the office. So I'm able to just pop on here and do it this way. So very, very exciting. Don't worry though, I still do have plenty of unnamed diet beverage. I don't have it in a glass cup, I have it in a paper cup. Great stuff there. I also have another paper cup with water in it. Furthermore, I'm here to just kind of get on here this afternoon, have a chat with you all. I'm going to make some opening remarks about a topic that I think all of you are ready to hear about. But it should be quite amusing. But if you haven't done so already, it would be really, really great. Really, really great. I'll get a little bit closer. How's that? Yeah. It would be really, really great if you could hit the like button, if you could hit the subscribe button, if you could hit the notifications bell. Make sure you get the notifications. And if you can do all of that, I will jump right into things and just have a quick conversation with you all, not about current events per se, but more about Marxism, socialism, ideology, etc. And from there, we will be able to I'll answer your super chats. Before that, we'll do our roll call. We'll do our normal format. Except I'll be in this new, unique, exciting background that we've got for today. So there you go. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, send your super chats. I will write them down and answer them at the end of the program. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to read to you a quotation. People always have been the foolish victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. Let me read it one more time. People have always been the foolish victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. Now that was said by Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, and it's in a famous essay that he wrote called Three Components of Marxism. A very important essay that Lenin wrote explaining Marxist teaching, Marxist ideology in pretty basic terms. I'll read it one more time. He said, people have always been the foolish victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. What does that mean? Well, it means that until you have a class view of things, until you start seeing things in terms of class politics, until you do that, you're never really going to be able to understand things. You're always going to be in a state of deception or self-deception. Is the right flight to parlor foreboding of the next rise of a new ideological danger? Next rise of new ideological danger. Wrote it down. Folks, I want to talk to you specifically about the issue of democracy and human rights, because this is an area in which there's a lot of deception and self-deception. But the thing is that a lot of people get blocked in this area. They just can't go there. They just can't go there. And if you're one of those people who gets blocked in this area, you're not going to get much out of what I'm going to say today. But let me describe what blocked means, right? So, for example, right, if someone is very, 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 very religious, very, very religious, and you start to argue with them about metaphysics, about the existence of God, etc., they're just going to have a block. In a lot of cases, they'll just say, you know what, I cannot pursue this argument with you. They'll just stop, right? And part of their mind will just stop. And the reason for that is you're not really arguing with them about ideas. You are threatening their entire worldview. They cannot argue with you about the existence of God because their entire worldview, the entire way they see themselves, is in jeopardy. So they just can't have that conversation with you. Right? And that happens around religion, that happens around politics. And this area that I'm talking about with you today, the issue of human rights, the issue of democracy, the issue of freedom, a lot of people get blocked there because the whole way that we come to think about politics in the United States and in the West in general is centered around these concepts and a certain way of understanding these concepts. And if you start to take that apart, it is so disorienting for some people that they have a block. They can't go there. They just can't go there. They get blocked. They get upset. They just can't go there. So if you're one of the people that has a block around the issue of human rights or the issue of democracy or the issue of freedom, if you just have a block around that issue, you're not going to get a lot of what I have to say. You're not going to get a lot out of what I have to say. But if you don't have a block around that issue and you're willing to explore with me the dialectical and historical materialist view of these concepts, I think that you will start to understand the world with a far, far greater level of depth. I think that your understanding of the world and world events and politics and why people act in certain ways, why certain things go on and certain things don't, I think that view will expand. If you will listen to what I have to say here, you will start to understand the world with a huge, huge amount of depth that you never had before. Now, maybe you already know what I'm about to say. A lot of you probably do. But for those of you who don't, I'm going to push the envelope today. And I'm going to force you to question some basic things that you've been taught all your life. And by doing that, I'll be getting you to go beyond bourgeois idealism and to grasp historical and dialectical materialism. And in doing that, you will understand the world far, far more than you have understood it before, if you are willing to go with me in this direction, if you are willing to keep your mind open enough to talk about what I'm saying to you here today. So I'm going to take another sip of unnamed diet beverage. And I'm going to jump right into it. Folks, the way we are taught in the United States to think about the concept of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, democracy, freedom of religion, elected governments, the way we are taught to think about these things is like this. There are some countries that are good, and those are countries that have democracy, that elect the government, that have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. And there are some countries that are bad, and they do not have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. They don't have real elections to elect their leaders, and those countries are bad. And the mission of the West is to spread democracy and freedom around the world. And enemies of the West, be they communists or fascists or whatnot, these are people who do not believe in freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, democracy, elected government. And the West battles against those people and spreads freedom throughout the world. Now, that's the way we're generally taught to think about the issue of freedom, human rights, democracy, etc. And on the surface, just accepting that narrative, it's already wrong, okay? And it's very easy to take apart, right? The United States backs, arms, and supports Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does not have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. It has a hereditary monarchy. It cuts off people's heads in public. 1/3 of the country are guest worker slaves who have no freedom whatsoever. You can get the death penalty for insulting the king or sorcery. So clearly Saudi Arabia is not, a free democratic society, and it's backed by the United States. So that shows hypocrisy. The United States condemns Syria, alleging it's not democratic. Saudi Arabia, is a brutal autocracy. The United States condemns Iran, says that, it doesn't have enough freedom of religion. Well, Saudi Arabia has no freedom of religion whatsoever, right? So on the surface, we can see that this narrative is loaded with hypocrisy. And during the Cold War, the main thing that leftists and socialists and communists did was go around exposing the hypocrisy of this narrative. The USA was constantly saying it was for democracy, communism is against democracy. But if you looked at all the allies of the United States, people like Augusto Pinochet, people like Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, people like brutal dictators in Indonesia, brutal dictators in Africa and Latin America, military juntas. The USA was going around saying it believed in freedom and democracy, and the communists were bad because they didn't believe in freedom and democracy, and it was pretty easy to show that there were all kinds of people associated with the United States, armed by the United States, backed by the United States, supported by the United States, who did not believe in freedom and democracy. And there were all kinds of brutal military coups. In 1965 in Indonesia, the elected government was toppled. Suharto took power, and there was a mass slaughter of roughly 500,000 people. It turned into a genocide of ethnically Chinese people. Later, there was a genocide in East Timor backed by the United States, right? All throughout Latin America, there were brutal military dictators, brutal military juntas backed by the United States. Elected governments were toppled and replaced by the military with the support of the CIA. 1953, in Guatemala, the people of Guatemala elected Arbenz, who was kind of a social democrat. The CIA overthrew him and put in a military dictatorship, right? Later in the 1980s, you had the military dictator Rios Montt, who was backed by the United States and committed mass genocide against native people, locked up all his political opponents. That was in Guatemala. You can talk about many examples throughout the Cold War of the United States backing and arming people who were not believers in democracy. And that is a very legitimate point. It shows that the leaders of the Western world are not true to their ideals, right? They claim they exist simply to spread freedom and spread democracy around the world. They claim communists are bad because communists don't believe in freedom and don't believe in democracy. Well, you can rip that to shreds by simply pointing out that the United States is not true to its own logic, right? That there are plenty of forces backed and supported by the United States that are not democratic, that are not adhering to human rights, that are violating human rights, that are brutal, that are dictatorial. But that, on the surface of it, that's a very good deconstruction of the Pentagon propaganda. It's good. It's a very good deconstruction of Pentagon propaganda, but it still doesn't get beyond the basic narrative. And often people who put that narrative out there still buy into the idea that there are just simply good countries and bad countries, and the good countries have freedom, the bad countries don't have freedom. Good countries have made a choice to have freedom, bad countries have just not made the choice to have freedom. And while they realize the United States is hypocritical around these issues, they still they essentially just want the United States to not be hypocritical around these issues. They want the United States to really practice what it preaches. But here's the thing, folks. Here's narrative is not correct. That narrative is not understanding the nature of human society and the nature of history. And that might be a little bit hard for people to swallow. But this narrative that we have in the West, that there are good countries and bad countries have freedom, bad countries don't have freedom, this narrative is a huge, huge, huge oversimplification. First of all, let's talk about the United States, right? The United States, let's talk about it. The United States was founded with some pretty good documents: the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But for the majority of U.S. history, there was slavery. Up until 1865, Civil War ends, you have slavery. Now, what was going on there? Well, they said these natural rights, these human rights, these natural rights, they just didn't apply to Africans. And I guess around the time that slavery was abolished, they discovered that these natural rights did apply to Africans. For the majority of U.S. history, women could not vote. So what do they say? Well, I guess, these natural rights existed. We just didn't realize, just slipped our minds that they also applied to women. But I guess, around 1920, we figured out that women have these natural rights also. Well, glad to hear it, Austin. Glad to hear it. And I'm glad, good luck to you out in Idaho, Austin. Right? 1920, we discovered that women have these natural rights. In fact, let's look at world history. No one anywhere in the world, no society anywhere in the world recognized that people had the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? Life, liberty, and property until like the 1400s. No one talked about it. No one discussed it. It just wasn't an issue. No one thought of it. No one talked about it. Now, these are supposed to be natural rights that we are endowed with by our Creator. But it never occurred to anybody that we should have freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or freedom of religion or the right to property or the right to peaceably assemble, or never occurred to anybody. No one thought of it until the 1400s. 1,400 years after the birth of Jesus Christ, people suddenly had the idea that we have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. That's a good thing. It was a very good development when people started thinking that way. But if these things are eternal concepts, if these are things that should exist in all societies at all times, why did we just discover them in the 1400s? Human beings have been around for thousands and thousands of years. Right? Human civilization, as we know it, didn't start until roughly 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So for the majority of human civilization, it never occurred to anyone that we should have freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Right? Freedom of religion, elected government. None of that ever occurred to anybody until like the 1400s. Why? Why? If these are natural rights, if these are universal, might be pushed left. If these are universal human rights that all human beings should have in all circumstances, that all societies should have in all circumstances, if all of your understanding of global politics and global situations is there are good countries that have these rights, there are bad countries that don't have these rights, If that is the situation, why, for the overwhelming majority of human existence, did no one ever talk about this and acknowledge this? Why? Right? This is a universal truth. This is something that is universal under all circumstances. All societies, all human beings should have the level of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly that Americans have in the year of 2020. If everyone in all of human history should have exactly the same level of freedom that I have right now, and if they don't have it, this is a crime being committed, this is a human rights violation, then why did no one even think about giving people these rights until like the 1400s? Why, for the beginning of U.S. history, did we not apply them to, the enslaved population? Why did we not apply these rights to women? What is going on here? Folks, human rights are good. I'm very happy that I have freedom of speech. I'm very happy that I have freedom of assembly. I'm very happy that I have freedom of religion. I'm very happy that I get to vote for my elected leaders. I'm very happy about all of those things. I would fight to defend those things. If someone was trying to come to the United States and take those things away from me, I would go out and fight to defend those rights. But why do I have them? Do I have them because all societies throughout human history have been evil? But then somebody in the 1400s said, we really ought to have some rights. And based on that, everything... is that what happened? No. Folks, nothing is eternal in the universe. Nothing is eternal in the universe. And you cannot separate political forms from economic forms. You cannot separate political forms from economic forms. Folks, can you see that? It says A does not equal A. A does not equal A. There is no way that this first A can be like this second A. There will always be some difference. Nothing in the universe is the same, and everything in the universe is constantly in a state of change. And one of the things that every ruling class in history has done is they have tried to present their society, their order, their political form, their economic form, their ideology, as if it is eternal. But the reality is that no ideology, no political form, no economic form is eternal. Everything is constantly in a state of change. Great example of this. My favorite example of this. This is the best example of this I can think of. When I was in high school, in my little town, many people were deeply religious and they were very opposed to gay marriage. Very opposed to gay marriage. And I remember 2004, on the ballot in Ohio, there was an amendment to the Ohio State Constitution to ban gay marriage. And in order to ban gay marriage, there was a lot of people going around urging people to vote to ban gay marriage. And they had a bumper sticker. I saw this bumper sticker many times, and I had this conversation many times with people as a high school student. The bumper sticker said, marriage equals one man plus one woman, and then it would have a Bible verse. One man plus one woman equals marriage. And then it would have a Bible verse. And that was the argument about why gay marriage should be outlawed. Well, I would argue with people. And I would say, have you ever read the Bible? Because Moses, his marriage was not one man plus one woman. Be a socialist, but not a communist. Oh, MLK. One man plus one woman was not the marriage that Abraham had. Abraham had quite a few wives. Moses had quite a few wives. Throughout the Old Testament of the Bible, there are many, many great holy prophets, men of God, described in the Bible, who have way more than one wife. So if there is this eternal form of marriage, where marriage is one man plus one woman, why, thousands of years ago, was that clearly not the case? Well, the reality is that the family, like every other institution, is constantly evolving and changing. For the majority of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherer civilization was the first human civilization, where human beings were in tribes of 25, 30 people, hunting and gathering. And in those tribes, there were no families. They didn't even keep track of whose kid was whose kid. There was no institution of marriage, and there was no institution of property. They were hunting and gathering as a tribe. There was definitely hierarchy in the tribe. There was definitely discipline in the tribe. There was definitely rules and order. But there was definitely not an institution of marriage. There was definitely not an institution of private property. And there were no formal classes, right? There were certainly hierarchies, I'm sure. But that was the majority of human civilization. You don't get the institution of marriage, you don't get the family, until you have the origin of private property. And when the institution of marriage and the institution of the family emerges, originally, that institution is not one man plus one woman. It is one man and all of his property and all of his wife and all of his children. Right? The family originally could include all kinds of things. The institution of patriarchy was a man and his property was a family, right? It's later that we get monogamy. There are parts of the world where they still have, polygamy, a man with many wives, right? Now, we have gay marriage in most Western countries, because there is no sacred, eternal way that the family should be. The family changed based on the economic base. The way the family started out, in the original economic form, there was no need for it. Hunter-gatherer civilization, there was no family structure. There was a tribe of people, and they were all one family. Next, you have slavery, feudalism, moving on, and that the way the family as an institution exists changes based on the economic form. Well, politics also changes based on the economic form. And the reason that no one thought of the idea of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly until about the 1400s in Europe is not because people were evil until then. That's wrong. The reason was that the stage of economic development had not yet gotten to the point to facilitate that level of freedom. Folks, in hunter-gatherer civilization, those people in hunter-gatherer civilization were working constantly in order to eat. They waged a daily battle for existence. They were not thinking about freedom of speech. They were not thinking about freedom of religion. They were just thinking about surviving. Right? The rise of subsistence farming, the rise of the domestication of animals, changes things, gives birth to new political forms. But, even feudalism. A feudal society is subsistence farming. You are growing enough food to eat. You are growing enough food to eat. Try running a society where you are just growing enough food to eat with freedom of assembly, with freedom of speech, with freedom of religion. Try running a feudal estate with that level of technology, that level of development, that level of barely getting by, right? Malnutrition-related deaths, short life expectancies. Try running a feudal estate on the basis of everyone can think whatever they want, do whatever they want, freedom of assembly. We're going to elect. It doesn't work. It wasn't until the rise of capitalism, until we got to a higher economic form called capitalism, that anybody ever talked about the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to vote, the right to elected government. Nobody talked about any of those things. Why? Because we had not yet reached the level of economic development to facilitate those things. And, let me add, we do not have those things in the United States if we were to enter a crisis. Read the Constitution. If we go to war in the United States, if war is actually declared, if there is a congressional declaration of war, your freedom of speech goes away, and your freedom of assembly goes away. If there is a domestic insurrection in the country, if there's a civil war going on, your freedom of speech goes away. Your freedom of assembly goes away. It is written into the U.S. Constitution that in a crisis, in a situation where society cannot facilitate those rights, your rights go away because of a situation of circumstances that facilitate that if the circumstances cannot facilitate your rights go away. And this is what we need to understand, is that freedom in any society is based on a level of economic development. The reason that I'm allowed to get on YouTube here and say all the things that I say, criticizing the status quo in the United States, is because of the fact the United States is stable enough as a country that what I'm saying does not result in any consequences for society. There is no danger that people will rise up and overthrow the U.S. government because of what I'm saying on here. There's no danger of instability taking place in U.S. society because of what I say. Right? You all are great. I love you all, but, what I say on here is not going to result in societal chaos. It is not going to result in the ruling class being overthrown. Because of that, I'm allowed to say it. This is what you need to understand. That freedom of speech in any society is based on a level of economic development and a level of stability in society. If a society does not have the level of economic development to facilitate freedom of speech, it doesn't have freedom of speech. If a society does not have a level of stability to facilitate freedom of speech, it doesn't have freedom of speech. And that you cannot separate political forms from economic forms. That rights do not exist in a vacuum. Rights do not exist in isolation from everything else. And we have to get beyond this notion of thinking about rights and freedoms as if they are eternal values. Right? It's just like that bumper sticker, 1 man plus 1 woman equals marriage. In the United States at this time, yes, not thousands of years ago, and not necessarily in the future. There's not an eternal form of marriage. And there is not an eternal form of the state and the government. The state did not exist in hunter-gatherer civilization, and the state, my hope is that eventually the state will wither away. But you cannot separate the economic form from the political form. And the goal of socialism and the goal of Marxism is to eventually get rid of the state. The goal is to eventually get to a world in which there is so much material abundance that the need for a state withers away, that there can be total freedom. People can just do what they feel like doing and take what they need and want from society, from each according to their own ability, to each according to his needs. That is the ultimate goal of a world with so much prosperity, so much abundance, that the need for any form of coercion, government, repression goes away. That is the ultimate goal. That is the ultimate goal. But the only way you can get there is by changing the economic form. To get to that highest political form requires getting to the highest economic form. Folks, is the USA a real democracy? A real democracy, meaning the rule of the people? Well, no. Any good American will tell you that we are a republic, not a democracy. We have a representative government. But it is democratic in the sense that we get to vote for our elected representatives. However, economics plays a pretty darn big role in how our representatives are selected and how it is determined who will be elected. Folks, Mike Pompeo is recently attacking the Islamic Republic of Iran on social media. Mike Pompeo, our lovely Secretary of State, warmongering psychopath, was on social media attacking the Islamic Republic of Iran. And he said, in his tirade against the Islamic Republic of Iran, he said that in Iran, hundreds of candidates are not allowed to run for office. And he said that proves that Iran is not a democratic country. Well, is it true that hundreds of candidates in Iran were barred from running for office? Yes. Before Iran has an election, they have a body called the Guardian Council. And this Guardian Council, made up of figures who were key in the Islamic Revolution, people that are in with the Shia Muslim ruling government, mullahs, ayatollahs, etc. They determine if someone is in line with the Islamic Republic and its constitution, and if they are approved to run for office, and if they are not approved to run for office. This Guardian Council, made up of people from the Islamic Revolution, determine who can run for office and who cannot. And it is official. It is in the Iranian constitution that the Guardian Council determines who is allowed to run for office and who is not. Once the Guardian Council approves somebody, they can run for office. The people get to vote for them. If the Guardian Council does not approve somebody, they do not get to run. All right? Now, that's not democratic, right? That is a restriction on democracy, right? It's not just anybody who wants to run for anything. The Guardian Council gets to decide who ultimately is allowed to run. That is a restriction on democracy. The thing is, we have that here in the United States. We have the exact same thing, except it's not codified into law. It's not codified into law, but we have the exact same thing. We have a vetting process in the United States. Before any election, the media, the politicians, the donor class, the intelligence agencies, they function as our de facto guardian council here in the United States. They determine who is treated fairly and who is treated as a legitimate candidate for office and who is not. They get together and they decide whose campaign will get funded, whose campaign will get positive media coverage, who will be treated as a serious candidate, and who will not. And they make it blatantly obvious in some instances. During the Democratic primary, Tulsi Gabbard and Kamala Harris were both polling between 0 and 1%. Kamala Harris, about between 0 and 1% supported her. Tulsi Gabbard, between 0 and 1% supported her. But look at the debates that happened on CNN. How much attention did Kamala Harris get? And how much attention did Tulsi Gabbard get? Our de facto guardian council decided for us that Kamala Harris was to be treated as a legitimate candidate and Tulsi Gabbard was not. And Tulsi Gabbard got lots of time on the debate stage. Kamala Harris did not. I'm sorry. Kamala Harris got lots of time on the debate stage, and Tulsi Gabbard did not. Right? Read about the meetings. The meetings that were held in Long Island, New York. The fundraiser galas where they decided that Kamala Harris, she was our woman. Read about the meetings where they decided Joe Biden was our guy. Read some of the leaked emails that came out in 2016 to make sure that Bernie Sanders was not going to be treated as a legitimate candidate. Folks, we have a guardian council in the United States. It's made up of the people who control the means of production. Right? In the United States, our means of production, our banks, our factories, our centers of economic power, our railways, our oil production, oil wells, our airlines, our telecommunications, our computer companies. These things are owned by a group of people called capitalists. They own major centers of economic power. They own them, and they operate these things that they own: banks, factories, big box stores, oil wells, telecommunications companies, tech giants, airlines. They operate them in order to make money for themselves. They own the means of production. And it is those who own the means of production that ultimately decide who is a legitimate candidate for office and who is not. They don't always agree with each other. There are big divisions among them. Some of them don't consider Donald Trump to be a legitimate candidate. Others do. Some of them don't consider Bernie Sanders to be a legitimate candidate. Others do. There are big disagreements among them. But among them, it is among those who control the means of production. It's among the ruling class of the United States, those who control the means of production. It is among them that the decision is made who is allowed to really be a candidate for office and who gets to have their name on the ballot and get ignored and get, just pretended, just ignored. They function as the guardian council of American capitalism. We have a guardian council, but it is not codified into law. It is a de facto guardian council. It is a rule of who has the most money. In Iran, the Guardian Council is certified into law. And in Iran, the Guardian Council is made up of the people who control the means of production, right? The biggest economic entity in the Islamic Republic of Iran is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a military organization formed and directed by the Iranian supreme leader. That's the biggest economic entity in Iran. It controls most of the means of production. You also have the Iranian state, which owns a number of major industries. And yes, there's a private sector in Iran, but that private sector in Iran is subordinated to this huge state apparatus called the Islamic Republic and the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And that huge state apparatus that controls the means of production, they're the ones that decide who gets to be the candidate. Just like in the United States, the people who control the means of production decide who gets to be a legitimate candidate. That's how it works. In the United States, the people who control the means of production are capitalists, owners of big banks, owners of big corporations, owners of tech giants, owners of big oil wells, owners of big banks, owners of Walmart, owners of Home Depot. They decide who's a legitimate candidate, and they are our guardian council. In Iran, the economy is controlled by the government and by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and by the mullahs and by the ayatollahs. And so, just like in the United States, the ayatollahs, the mullahs, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they get together and they have the Guardian Council and they decide who's allowed to run for office. It's the same thing, except our means of production is owned by private capitalists who use them to make profits. Their means of production is controlled by the people who overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic, religious leaders. In Iran, the people who control the means of production decide who's allowed to be treated as a legitimate candidate and run for office. In the United States, the people who control the means of production decide who's allowed to be a legitimate candidate and who's allowed to run for office. The class that controls the means of production also ends up controlling the political forms. And that's true for any society. In China, the Communist Party functions similar to how the Guardian Council functions in Iran. The Communist Party decides who can run for office, who can be treated as a legitimate candidate. There are other parties in China, but the Communist Party, at the end of the day, the people who overthrew the government of Chiang Kai-shek, who established the People's Republic, the Communist Party decides who can run for office, who can be treated as a legitimate candidate is decided by the Communist Party. Why? Because the Communist Party controls the means of production. In China, there are a lot of private companies, a lot of private industries, but at the end of the day, the major banks, the major industries are all controlled by the Communist Party, and the government state central plan determines what goes on in production, so even private companies have to do what it says. So the Communist Party controls the means of production, and the Communist Party decides who can run for office. At the end of the day, the USA and China are about just as democratic. Right? There's certainly nowhere near the level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in China, right? I mean, in China, people don't have the same level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. That's true. But you have to remember, China's a much less stable society. There's a lot more poverty in China, right? There's a lot more terrorist groups and people trying to overthrow them, and a lot more instability. But at the end of the day, in the United States, the people who control the means of production determine who gets to run for office. In China, the people who control the means of production determine who gets to run for office, right? It's not as hard to understand as you might think, but we're entering that dangerous area. We're entering this area where people get blocked, right? Because we're deconstructing this logic that says there are good countries and bad countries, there are countries with freedom, there are countries that are dictatorships. No, every country is a dictatorship. As long as one group of people controls the means of production. As long as the means of production are controlled by one group of people, that group of people that controls the means of production is going to control the politics. On capitalism, they control it in a default manner. When countries break free from capitalism, they codify their control. But at the end of the day, those who control the means of production control society. In China, it is a proletarian party, a party with 90 million members, based among the population at large. They've got members in every apartment building, they've got members in every little hut in every little village. The Chinese Communist Party, with its 90 million members, controls the means of production, and it controls the Chinese state. And yes, people vote, there are elections and such, but the Communist Party decides who gets to run, makes sure that people that run for office are in line with what the Communist Party wants, because the Communist Party controls the means of production. In the United States, the capitalists control the means of production, and the capitalists decide who gets to run for office. They make sure that the people who get elected in the government are in line with their vision of what it means to run society. The people who... This is how these things work. And in terms of freedom, freedom to protest, freedom to dissent, in societies that are very, very, very stable, you can protest, you can dissent. In societies that are not very stable, you can't. If there was a civil war in the United States right now, I wouldn't be able to speak to you the way I'm speaking right now. But there's not. Right? It's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. It's a very, very hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. But this narrative that there are good countries and bad countries have freedom, bad countries don't, this is wrong. It's not understanding the nature of reality. If the United States were at a lower level of economic development, there would be a lower level of freedom. If the United States were at a lower level of stability, there would be a lower level of freedom. Just so happens that because of global imperialism, because the United States is at the center of the global economy, there is a high level of stability here, and there is a high level of economic development here. So as a result, there is a high level of freedom, and that's a good thing. That is a good thing. But if that were not the case, if there were a lower level of economic development here, there were a lower level of stability here, there would be a lower level of freedom. I'm repeating myself because these are very, very difficult things for a lot of people to understand. These are not simple concepts. This is not something people naturally come to understand in U.S. society. Everything is set up to keep you from understanding this. You are not supposed to understand this. But this is how these things work. And the goal of socialism is to raise the level of development and stability across the entire world so high, not only so high that everyone has the same level of freedom that we have here in the United States, but so high that we have even more freedom than we have in the United States right now. The goal of socialism and communism is to raise the level of abundance, raise the level of stability in society so high that the need for a government, the need for a state, withers away. That is the goal. But that cannot happen when the means of production, the major centers of economic power, the banks, factories, and industries, are operated simply to make a profit for those who own them. In order to establish the level of economic development that can facilitate more freedom than any of us can ever imagine, you must have a centrally planned economy. The means of production must operate rationally. Last live, I talked to you all about the fact that under capitalism, people are homeless because there are too many houses. Under capitalism, people are hungry because there is too much food. That capitalism is a highly irrational system. Capitalism is a system that creates poverty amid abundance. Capitalism is a system that, as technology advances, the result is greater poverty because people lose their jobs and are replaced by machines. Capitalism is a system where, a lot of times stores, will dump their food out at the end of the night and pour motor oil on it because they don't want some homeless person to eat it out of the garbage. Why? Because they didn't produce that food so people could eat it. They produced that food so it could be sold. Production for profit, not production for social use. This is capitalism, right? I've used the example many times of how in Union Square, Burlington Coat Factory was throwing out a bunch of old coats they couldn't sell. But before they threw them away, they took a knife and cut them up. Why? They didn't want a homeless person to take them out of the garbage, because if that happened, a homeless person might not buy a coat from them. Production, they didn't, for profit, not for use. They didn't make those coats so people could wear them. They made those coats so they could make a profit from them. Capitalism is a highly unrational, non-rational, irrational system. Capitalism is a system of production for profit. Under capitalism, you can have all kinds of homeless people, all kinds of empty houses. Under capitalism, you can have people starving because too much food is being produced. There's an old anecdote called the coal miner's riddle. Very famous. There's a little boy, and he's freezing cold. The father says to the little boy, "Son, are you cold?" He says, "Yes, Father, I'm cold. Why am I so cold?" The father says, "Because I can't afford to buy any coal to heat our house with." The son says, "Father, why can you not afford to buy any coal to heat our home with?" The father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine, and I don't have any paycheck now to buy the coal with." And the son says to the father, "Father, why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" He says, "I lost my job at the coal mine because there's too much coal." That's capitalism. The family is freezing. The father is unemployed because too much coal has been produced. And the point of socialism origins of capitalism debate. The point of socialism is to create a situation where abundance does not lead to poverty. The point of socialism is to cease production for profit, is to have the means of production controlled by society. It's so we the people and our revolutionary organizations take control of the means of production. And with our control of the means of production, we get rid of this contradiction. No more do we have people homeless because there's too many houses. No more do we have people hungry because there's too much food. Because the means of production are centrally planned by society. A revolutionary organization, a revolutionary state, takes control of the means of production. And by doing so, forces them to no longer operate according to simply what is profitable. Profits in command are done away with. And when profits in command are done away with, at that point, the level of growth is unlimited. Development can expand, and we can continue to aim for that higher and higher goal of a stateless, classless world. I'm just going to end by reading how Karl Marx explained it. China has smaller parties in their united front. Writing it down. This is how Karl Marx explained it, and this is how I'll end my opening remarks. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Let's break that down. In a higher phase of communist society, meaning not socialism, not the first stage, right? Not just after the workers have taken power, not what China is right now, not what Cuba is right now, the higher stage, the ultimate stage. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, meaning that there's no longer even a division between those who work with their hands and those who work with their minds, right? That the division between physical labor and mental labor is broken down. We no longer have some people who work with their brains and some people who work with their bodies. China superpower. Anthony Sutton. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, meaning that people no longer are going to work simply because they have to pay their bills, but when we have reached a state where people find work fulfilling, because technology has advanced so much and work in and of itself is rewarding, after the labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, meaning that people live to work. They go to work to create, to use their minds, to be creative. They find work to be fulfilling. Work is no longer alienated when work is rewarding. After the productive forces have increased with the all-around development of the individual, meaning that everyone's work is an expression of their individuality, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly because the means of production is rationally controlled cooperatively, and because technology has advanced, so much abundance is being created. The springs of cooperative wealth are flowing more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So only after rationally controlling the means of production, raising the level of productivity so high, raising the level of abundance so high, getting to the point where there's no division between mental and physical labor, getting to the point where people only work because they enjoy it, right? That work is no longer a degrading, alienating experience, but we get to the point that work is a fulfilling experience. It's life's prime want. Only when, as he says, the productive forces have increased the all-around development of the individual, and the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society ascribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. That is the goal. The goal is to reach a level of material abundance in which everyone has total freedom. Not just freedom of speech, not just freedom of assembly, but freedom to do whatever they want. People work because they feel like working, because it gives them fulfillment. There's no need for a government. There's no need for a prison. People do what they want to do. People take what they need, right? That is the ultimate goal. The goal of communism is total freedom, a level of freedom beyond anything any of us can imagine. That is the goal of communism. But just like the freedom we have now, just like the freedoms that have existed before, freedom is rooted in economics. You cannot separate political forms from economic forms. Freedom is not eternal, just like the family is not eternal. Nothing in the universe is eternal. Everything is in a state of constant flux. And the goal is to build a society with so much freedom and so much abundance and so much prosperity that all of us can live a life beyond anything we can imagine, full of prosperity, abundance, liberty, and happiness. That is how Marxists and socialists understand the concepts of human rights, of liberty, democracy, equality, etc. And this is the conversation that you need to have. This is what you need to understand if you want to engage in our world, where the illusion and the values of liberals are being passed off as the truth. And on that note, that concludes my opening remarks. So why don't we do our roll call? I'll call you out as I see you. And then from there, after the roll call is done, I will answer your super chat questions. How's that? Who's with us today? Names and locations, names and locations. Somewhere, USA. Mom's Basement, New Zealand. Belgrade. Dallas, Texas. JT24 in Mississippi. New Jersey, Pasta Bazooka. San Jose. Ali from Northern Ireland. Utah. Nigeria. Florida. Up the IRA, Dallas, Zach in Dallas, Milan, Sacramento, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Jersey, South Virginia, Van City, Canada, Clydebank, Vallejo, California, San Miguel Allende, Mexico, McAllen, Knoxville, Tennessee, Manchester, UK, Everett, Washington, California, the Mormon Theocracy of Utah, trying to say the name of his place, Badall, Southwest France, Houston, hello, says Bill from the United States, Fairhope, Alabama, Provo confirmed, Belgium, Paris, Jess, Oregon, Iran, Maryland, Denver, who else is with us? Edinburgh, Scotland, Ken from Connecticut, Morocco, Guyson, Pennsylvania, Ramiro in East LA is with us. Welcome, welcome. Niagara Falls, Austin, Cleveland Pirate Alex. Welcome, welcome, Pirate Alex. Welcome, welcome. Antoine from France. Ithaca, New York. Michael, occupied Ireland, says Joseph V. Welcome, 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 welcome. Welcome, 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 welcome. Gateshead, England is with us. Union, New Jersey is with us. Stephen Clearly. Very good, Stephen. Luther, France. Very good. Who else is with us today? Kenny from Malaysia, Leipzig, East Germany, Atatis, Bendigo, Australia, David Fox, Julian in East Sussex, UK, South Carolina, Cornwall, United Kingdom. Very good. I'm doing it early in this afternoon. A lot of European folks on today. That's good. Trevor in Ireland, Cornwall, UK, Naples, Florida. Harold Sullivan is with us. Northern Michigan, Rebuilding America. Very good. The Netherlands. Netherlands in the house. Lots of Europeans today. Good time. I'm glad to have some Europeans on here. Often I do these late at night, and that's not good. Occupied Palestine. Very good. Very good. Very good, folks. Keep the super chats rolling in. I will answer your super chats as they come in. I've got a few to get over that I wrote down, and we will obviously answer them. But yes, keep the super chat questions rolling in. I will give you an answer to your super chat questions. I hope that was an illuminating opening presentation. If you're just joining us now, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell so you get informed the next time we do one of these. All right. Very, very, very good. Very, very good. Very, very, very good. So like I said, folks, if you have a super chat question, I will write it down and you will be on the list to answer. So I will just go ahead and start answering the questions. These are the super chat questions, and I will be answering them bit by bit. All right. Someone asked, is the next rise of a new ideological danger on the rise? Is the right's decline going to present the rise of a new ideological danger? No. Donald Trump, I don't think, is going anywhere. He may be leaving office, but I think he's going to be starting, he's going to be starting his own TV station, and that there is always going to be a right wing in the United States, and there is a very strong synthetic left in the United States, and I don't think... will new ideological dangers arise? Will there be new, opponents of Bangkok? Will there be new opponents? Of course, there will be, and we will address them as they arise. But at the moment, I don't see any particularly new ideological danger on the horizon. All right, will Joe Biden be pushed to the left like FDR? It's possible. The reason that FDR was pushed to the left is because there was a division within his own class over the Great Depression and how to deal with it, and also internationally, right? That the National Association of Manufacturers, Henry Morgan and Henry Ford wanted to align with the Nazis, whereas the Rockefellers wanted to align with the British, right? And that meant aligning with the Soviet Union. There was a division domestically and internationally in the ruling class. The industrial capitalists during the 1930s wanted to align with Hitler and the Nazis. Henry Ford was very tight with the Nazis, the Morgans, and the industrial capitalists did not want labor unions in their factories. The finance capitalists and the oil capitalists, they favored aligning with the British because the British were all about controlling the trade routes. That's Atlanticism, right? And they controlled the oil trade and they controlled banking. And so the finance capitalists and the oil capitalists aligned with the British, and that was the division. And Roosevelt was in with the Rockefeller family, in with the British, and they were the ones that favored aligning with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. And because they were facing a fascist threat from the factory owners, because the factory owners tried to overthrow Roosevelt in the 1934 business plot, because of that, they were supporting the labor movement. And Roosevelt, at one point blatantly endorsed the labor movement. 1937, 1936, 1937, the sit-down strike wave. You have Roosevelt defending the right of workers to occupy their factories in strikes. And because they wanted to align with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. That was the feeling that the Rockefellers and the British wanted. They wanted the Soviets as an ally against the Nazis. Because of that, the communist parties were considered allies of the Roosevelt coalition. This was a Bonapartist struggle in the ruling class. Roosevelt, he took control of the government as the president, and he was aligned with one faction in the ruling class, and he beat down another section of the ruling class. And the Communist Party was able to unionize the steel industry, the car industry, car manufacturing, rubber manufacturing. A huge level of industrial unionism exploded under Roosevelt. The Roosevelt administration said workers not only had the right to join unions, but should join unions. The Communist Party built the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and the industrial capitalists, the National Association of Manufacturers, Henry Ford, they were beaten back, and that was the 1930s, and that was a division. The reason that Roosevelt was pushed to the left, number one, was because the Soviet Union was an important ally against the British ally with the British and the Americans against Hitler. Right, 1935, FDR recognized the USSR, which was a big deal. Right, the United States had not recognized the USSR. 1935, the USA recognized diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. 1936-37, Roosevelt basically embraced the CIO, and the sit-down strike wave. And the Flint sit-down strike, he sent the military to protect the strikers in Flint, Michigan. And, Roosevelt said workers had the right to occupy their factories. And because of that, because Roosevelt was under attack from a fascist threat, and because the Soviet Union existed and was a key ally of the British and the Americans internationally, that created an opening where Roosevelt entered an alliance with the Soviet Union and with the communists and with the labor movement. And that is what opened the door to Roosevelt moving far to the left. Wasn't Roosevelt's personal wishes. I mean, it may have been, right? That may have been a factor. Roosevelt, he went to a very progressive elementary school that was taught by Endicott Peabody. You can Google Endicott Peabody. Endicott Peabody was the principal of a very, very elite, expensive New England elementary school that Roosevelt went to. And it was a religious elementary school, but it was very progressive. And Endicott Peabody, who was Roosevelt's principal of his elementary school, was a socialist. He was a Christian socialist, and he really worked very, very hard. It was an elite school for rich boys. But the Christian socialist principle really pushed Christian socialist values onto the young boys who went to this New England preschool, or this New England school for young men. So that probably had an impact on Roosevelt's development. But there are many people who went to the Endicott Peabody School who didn't become socialists, right? That certainly happened, right? I mean, there were a lot of elite children who went to this school. A lot of people who went on to become presidents and congressmen and stuff went to the school of Endicott Peabody. But Endicott Peabody, as a very, very skilled and respected educator, one of the most elite schools in the country, Roosevelt got a Christian socialist education in New England. That's pretty neat. But regardless, the main reason that Roosevelt went to the left was because there was a fight in the bourgeoisie. He wanted the Soviet Union as an ally. He was being threatened by the factory owners. And it was the material conditions. And in those material conditions, that created an opening for the Communist Party to build the CIO, to unionize factories, to lead the sit-down strike wave. William Z. Foster and others, Wyndham Mortimer, Bill McKay, who was the leader of the union effort at Ford Motor Plant. It created an opening for great labor leaders, Paul Robeson, William L. Patterson. It created an opening for the class struggle, right? And a lot of great revolutionary leaders saw that opening and that strategic alliance with Roosevelt as an opening to do great revolutionary work. There was the Soviet Union that existed, and that, was a situation where Roosevelt was pushed to the left. Now, could such a thing happen with Biden? Sure, it could happen, but that's not a guarantee that it will happen. But it could, yeah. I mean, there could be a situation where Biden was facing some kind of, right-wing coup, and based on that, he needed to court the alliance of progressives. It certainly is not going to line up the way it did in the 1930s because there's no Soviet Union now, and there's no, Communist Party that is aligned with the Soviet Union that has, tens of thousands of members, and is big in the labor movement, right? I mean, that's not the situation we're in. The Soviet Union, the Communist Party controlled a lot of labor unions, and they had their own labor federation, the TUUL, and then they formed the CIO along with John L. Lewis. That's not the situation we're in. We don't have that. But, there are things that happen. For example, one thing that surprised me was right in the lead up to the recent election, the New York Times, which is a liberal newspaper, exposed the Falun Gong. Now, Falun Gong is a longtime CIA asset. It's a religious cult that is fanatically anti-communist and fanatically anti-China. And they are Democrats. They used to be Democrats. They loved Obama. They recruit liberals. I see them in New York City all the time doing their exercise. It's a scary anti-China cult subsidized by the CIA. But because Trump is so anti-China, Falun Gong signed up and they were for Trump. And so in the lead up to the election, and Epoch Times is a website that they control, Epoch Times. I understand they have ads, on YouTube, sometimes even on my videos, they have ads for the Epoch Times. But the Epoch Times, as a result of the fact that Epoch Times was supporting Donald Trump, the New York Times finally exposed Epoch Times and the Falun Gong. Now, that wouldn't have happened if there weren't big divisions in the ruling class over China and over Trump, right? And that created a situation where the New York Times finally was given permission. The New York Times, this stuff is very, very closely controlled. The New York Times got the go-ahead that it was okay to expose the Falun Gong. That was a division in the ruling class. So these things do happen. They're not unheard of. It's worth pointing out. Could Biden be pushed to the left? It's possible. I don't necessarily see it happening, but it's possible, right? These things do happen. And when politicians are under attack, when they're facing an onslaught from the rest of their class, they tend to become desperate for international allies and for domestic allies. But however, at this point, consider talking about this. I would consider talking to him. I don't know who he is. But at this point, I think Biden is representing the majority of the ruling class. And I don't think he's desperate for allies. But who knows what could develop. But at this point, I think, Biden is in the majority position within the ruling class. He's got a lot of support. I don't think it's anything near the Roosevelt situation. So there you go. Okay. So Martin Luther King Jr. said he was a socialist, not a communist. What does that mean? Well, okay, so you have to listen to that actual speech, right? So Martin Luther King Jr., he believed in, he was a Christian, and if you listen to his speech, he was very adamant that he was not in favor of Marxism. And he said that he felt Marx distorted Hegel's teachings, and he's very, very critical of Marxism. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said he was in favor of what he called a democratic form of socialism. And Martin Luther King was hanging out with Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington went on to be a founder of the Democratic Socialists of America. He was in the Socialist Party, but Michael Harrington is largely described as a State Department socialist. Michael Harrington had served in the administration of Lyndon Johnson. Michael Harrington was a good friend of Max Shachtman, the Trotskyite, former Trotskyite, who ended up supporting the Vietnam War and supporting the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Michael Harrington was like a social democrat. He wrote a book called The Other America, which was about poverty in the United States, an expose of poverty among low-income folks in urban areas, as well as in Appalachia and in the South. It was a best-selling book in the early 60s called The Other America, Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington worked with Lyndon Johnson to change the food stamps program in the United States, to start Head Start, the Head Start program for kids, and he was kind of a social reformer, kind of a liberal, Michael Harrington. And in the final years of Dr. Martin Luther King's life, when he started emphasizing economic justice, Martin Luther King was hanging out a lot with Michael Harrington. And Michael Harrington probably influenced Dr. Martin Luther King, and that's where you get Dr. Martin Luther King saying that he believed in a, quote, democratic form of socialism. But Martin Luther King emphasized, though, he always emphasized that he did not believe in Marxism, right? And I mean, he was a Christian pastor. Marxism is dialectical and historical materialism. Dr. Martin Luther King emphasized he didn't believe in that. Dr. Martin Luther King emphasized he did not believe in Marxism-Leninism. He was not a communist. He was a social democrat. And really, that's what you can describe Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as. He was a social democrat. Dr. Martin Luther King's career began mainly because he wasn't a communist, right? In Montgomery, Alabama, the Montgomery bus boycott was being organized, and there were a number of pastors in the city, and some of them wouldn't support Dr. Martin Luther King and would not support, some of them wouldn't support the boycott, like Condoleezza Rice, her father, wouldn't support the boycott. He just didn't believe in the boycott, but there were other pastors in Montgomery, Alabama, who, were in favor of the Montgomery bus boycott and anti-Jim Crow activism. But because they had been doing it for years, most of them were older, they had ties to the Communist Party, because it used to be only the Communist Party marched against racism, right? It used to be the Communist Party was like the only organization on a national level that opposed Jim Crow segregation. So a lot of the older pastors in Montgomery, Alabama had to take a back seat. Bayard Rustin, who was Dr. Martin Luther King's right-hand man, had been a member of the Communist Party at one point. So because of that, he had to take a back seat. But Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was young enough, he was in his early 30s, that he could be the face of the Montgomery bus boycott, and no one could call him a communist, because he never had any associations with any communist groups. Not that they didn't dig some stuff up, like he went to an event at something that they said was a communist training school, and so blah, blah, blah. They had a poster. There was a book publisher, a guy who worked at a book publishing firm who had been a Communist Party member at one point. But Martin Luther King Jr., it was very hard to establish that he'd been a communist, as he wasn't. And then in the final years of his life, right, we're talking like 1966, 1967, he was ultimately killed in 1968. In April of 1968, he was killed. In the final years of Dr. Martin Luther King's life, he started talking about economic justice, and he started hanging out with Michael Harrington. I answered that already. I answered that question already, Joseph. In the final years of his life, Dr. Martin Luther King, he was talking about democratic socialism. And then he was killed. And, he led a lot of struggles for economic justice. And he organized something called Resurrection City, which was like a poor people's march on Washington. He didn't live to actually complete it, but there was like a big demonstration of poor people in Washington, D.C. And the Democratic Party, there was an essay by Francis Fox Piven called The Weight of the Poor. And that starting in the early 60s, there were divisions in the ruling class between, the military-industrial complex and the CIA, and the liberal New England Eastern establishment versus the military-industrial complex. That was a fight that was going on, and the right wing had a network of people that were supporters of them. The John Birch Society, fanatical right-wing organizations had a lot of power. So in the early 60s, the Democratic Party was trying to figure out how they could start to have some power. And there was an essay, that's really where Francis Fox Piven comes from. I know Glenn Beck and the right wing made a big deal. Francis Fox Piven. Well, Francis Fox Piven was an academic. And she wrote an essay called The Weight of the Poor, basically arguing that Democrats should figure out how to use low-income people as their foot soldiers against the John Birch Society and against the groups that the right wing uses their foot soldiers, right? The right wing have all these religious folks who do their bidding. They have the John Birch Society. They have like small business owners. They've got people that are their foot soldiers that like push the right wing agenda. And Frances Fox Piven wrote an essay basically saying Democrats ought to figure out how to have poor people be their foot soldiers. And Saul Alinsky, do folks know Saul Alinsky? That name comes up also. He's a very big name among like liberal social democratic organizers. Saul Alinsky, who had been around the Communist Party in the 1930s, he was from Chicago, and he had been friendly with the Communist Party, and they had taught him how to organize unemployment councils, and he'd done organizing of low-income people in Chicago, and he worked with John L. Lewis, the founder of the CIO, leader of the miners' union. And Saul Alinsky, he was a Democrat. He broke with the Communist Party. Saul Alinsky, he also was talking about how do we use low-income people as foot soldiers for the Democratic Party. And he wrote Rules for Radicals. And this is where Acorn comes from. This is where, if you read Saul Alinsky, Frances Fox Piven, the theory is how can we organize poor people to be foot soldiers of the Democratic Party, right? The Republicans have the religious right. They have these groups that they use as their foot soldiers. How do we maneuver low-income people to be our foot soldiers? And that's basically, what Way to the Poor and Michael Harrington and the Poor People's Campaign of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. fit into that, basically. It was that kind of conversation was happening among liberal academics. How do we use poor people as our foot soldiers against the foot soldiers of the right? What's also interesting about that, I was going to make one more point about that, and I can't remember what it was. What's interesting about that, I guess, is that that the Democrats made a decision really in the 80s with the rise of the Democratic Leadership Council that they weren't going to use these folks. They were not going to talk about economic issues. That was kind of a decision the Democrats made, that they were going to have identity politics foot soldiers. They were not going to have economic foot soldiers. And I think that might be probably the primary division between the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and the Hillary Clinton DNC wing is, are we going to have foot soldiers? Are we going to use activists that are motivated by identity politics, or are we going to have activists that are motivated by economic issues? That was probably the primary division. And that, Frances Fox Piven, her great achievement, she's this academic, and she's still around, is Sanders an attempt at Dems having an Alinsky? Well, not exactly. Alinsky was a strategist. Sanders is a politician. But the strategy was use low-income people fighting for economic justice as foot soldiers to the Democratic Party. Sanders is a politician, but Alinsky was a strategist. Frances Fox Piven was a strategist. That was the idea. And their big achievement was the motor voter law, actually. The motor voter law, which is that you can now register to vote at a DMV, at a Department of Motor Vehicles. Every person, most of the country, not in New York City, but in most of the country, if you have a job, you have to have a car. And so having it so people can register to vote at the same place they go to get their driver's license renewed made it so more poor people would vote. That is Frances Fox Piven's great achievement. So there you go. Dr. Martin Luther King, he was a social democrat, and he was involved in poor people's campaigns, and he was involved in these efforts to mobilize low-income people. The same kind of thing that that Saul Alinsky was doing during that time. The same kind of thing that Frances Fox Piven was pushing. Michael Harrington, in the final years of his life, as Dr. Martin Luther King was emphasizing economic justice, he was in that milieu, and so he started talking about democratic socialism. But he was never a communist. He was never a Marxist. I guess that's that. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Origins of capitalism debate. Well, I haven't watched that particular debate. Is BLM AstroTurf? Okay, all right, we'll talk about that. BLM AstroTurf. The origins of capitalism debate. How did capitalism start? Right? The way that free market libertarians generally argue is they make it sound like all the richest capitalists, they earned it, right? They just worked hard, and by the sweat of their brow, they earned it. And that's bullshit. The way the wealth was acquired by the capitalists was through mass theft, right? The clearing of the commons in the Middle Ages, the way the land was divided up in the United States was certainly not fair and democratic. The Native Americans were robbed of it, first of all. But second of all, on top of the Native Americans being robbed of their land, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Okay. All right. Grave diggers. But on top of that, even among the white settlers, the land was not divided up fairly. There was huge amounts of nepotism in who got the land. The railroad monopolies got big chunks of the land. The slave owners got big chunks of the land. And that the way the wealth of this world, in terms of natural resources, land, property, was acquired was not fair and democratic. It was very nepotistic. The government handed out the wealth of the world to wealthy people, and that the origins of capitalism. There's actually probably the most interesting part of Capital, Karl Marx's book Capital. The most interesting part of it is called On Primitive Accumulation, and it involves how capitalism came into existence with mass genocide in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the United States, slavery, and genocide even in Europe, mass murder and killing in Europe, UBI, temporary. All right, and the clearing of the commons, the execution of all kinds of vagrants, the destruction of feudalism involved all kinds of deaths. 100 million people. All right. So that's the important point. China has smaller parties in their united front, and that is true, right? In addition to the Communist Party, you have the left KMT, members of the KMT party that supported the People's Republic, that broke with Chiang Kai-shek. There's a Peasants' Party, I believe. There are some smaller parties in the united front. And that's true. When China was originally formed, it was not a socialist country. It was what they called a people's democratic country, right? Across Eastern Europe and in China originally, these countries originally did not call themselves socialist countries. They were people's democratic republics, right? That's why it's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Yemen. And the idea was it was a united front of all the anti-fascist and anti-imperialist elements, right? It was a united front government. But the communists were the leaders of that united front, and they became the dominant forces. But in Korea, in China, etc., they were the dominant element in a united front. And in China, right, the Communist Party was the dominant leader of a united front against the Japanese invaders, and then eventually a united front for free elections. Right, Chiang Kai-shek would not allow free elections. He would not allow the Communist Party to participate in the elections. So there you go. All right. China superpower Anthony Sutton. Well, I don't know what the questioner was getting at about that. Anthony Sutton is this right-wing guy who, thinks that all communists are secretly part of a big conspiracy by Wall Street, and I don't know what he's getting at about China being a superpower. China is a superpower, that's true. I haven't followed events in Bangkok enough to give you a good answer on that question. So unfortunately, I can't do that. So Black Lives Matter, AstroTurf, question mark. Well, here's the thing. There's no question that the uprising in our society against police brutality is 100% legitimate, right? And there's no question about that, right? That police brutality is a problem that has plagued the black community for years and years and years and years. And it used to be nobody talked about it. When I was in Cleveland, I would go to protests. I was a communist, and I would go to protests with Black on Black Crime Incorporated, which was an NGO led by Art McCoy of Superfly Barbershop. And there were police brutality cases that would be in court for years in Cleveland, and they got no publicity. Nobody talked about them. And we protested police brutality, and it was an ongoing problem in Cleveland, and the media just ignored it. You can talk about there big cases like Rodney King, like Sean Bell in New York City, etc. But it has been an ongoing problem in the black community, and there's been growing rage about it. Knowledge of the prison industrial complex and prisons for profit has been widespread in the black community, growing rage about it. So the fact that, what happened was Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, was supposed to make these issues improve, and instead he made things worse, right? Things were getting worse under Obama. Shouldn't we push Western governments to bring back, and that would lead to the funding. Okay, bring back manufacturing. And, Barack Obama, the first black president, was supposed to make these things better. Instead, things got worse under Barack Obama. There was more mass incarceration, there was more police brutality, and that led to an explosion. There was just an explosion from below. The people had enough. They weren't going to take it anymore. And Obama and the ruling class of the United States tried to control it. And I think they're still trying to control it, right? And George Floyd, another big explosion. I think they're still trying to control it. But it's happening. The explosion is happening, and they're trying to control it. Now, one of the ways they try to control it is they set up organizations that they fund with their money. And these organizations dominate these spontaneous uprisings and push them in a way that is not anti-imperialist. Like to form a group. Okay, so I guess I'll just read out what you said there, Jesse. All right. Okay, so and so, yeah, Black Lives Matter Incorporated, not the movement, not the number of people that went out and protested against police brutality, but BLM Incorporated is funded by George Soros and the Ford Foundation, and it is an effort to try and control this uprising. And I think the main thing that they're worried about, I think the main thing that they're afraid of, is that what they're afraid of is that they're afraid that black nationalists will lead it. They don't want Minister Louis Farrakhan or other black leaders like Minister Farrakhan to be leading the uprising against police brutality. So they've created a number of very liberal organizations controlled by liberal academics and funded by big foundations to try and control the uprising. But it's important that you say that, because there's a lot of people who will say, "Oh, Black Lives Matter is a big conspiracy." No, it's not. It's a real issue. There's real anger about it. Don't doubt that for a minute. However, are there attempts by the establishment to control it? Absolutely, there are, and there should be no need to deny that. All righty. Okay. Gravediggers. It's the gravediggers of capitalism. What the bourgeoisie produces above all else is its own gravediggers. Hey, Caleb, I just finished an hour of powerlifting. Enjoying your talk. Great, Joseph. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. I'm really, really glad to hear that. Now, Marx said that what capitalism produces above all else is its own gravediggers, and that is correct. That capitalism makes the lives of the working class worse and worse and worse, and inspires them to rise up and overthrow the system. That is absolutely correct. Capitalism is producing its own gravediggers. No question about it. Universal basic income as a temporary solution. Well, I would be for a universal basic income, but it's not a solution, right? I mean, it's a good thing. It would be a victory for the people, but ultimately it doesn't resolve the basic problem of capitalism, of the means of production operating for profit, right? I would rather people have a universal basic income than not have it, right? However, at the same time, that is not the solution. And there's another video I made where I expressed some of my big concerns about universal basic income. There are some dangers inherent in universal basic income. There are some very big dangers inherent in it, but it's overall a good concept. I think part of the issue is that, first of all, you have people like Milton Friedman and advocates of neoliberalism who advocate universal basic income because they see it as a way to get rid of government bureaucracy, right? They say, the idea is universal basic income will replace all other social programs. So it's like, we're going to get rid of the food stamps. We're going to get rid of Social Security. We're going to get rid of Medicaid. We're going to get rid of all the programs, but everyone just gets an automatic bank deposit, $1,000 a month, right? And to neoliberal free market people, that's great, right? It's like, okay, well, if you have to give people stuff, let's just give them an automatic bank deposit. And then, but what happens is you lose all the good paying government jobs of all the people that run food stamps, all the people that run unemployment insurance, all the people that run these things. They get rid of all of those people, right? And that is a problem because you've just eliminated all kinds of good paying jobs from the economy, right? So that's a problem, right? That's not what Andrew Yang advocates. That's what some advocates of universal basic income advocate, right? Is they see it as a way to shrink the size of government bureaucracy, which would hurt the economy in the long term because everyone getting $1,000 a month doesn't make up for all kinds of people that are making very good salaries at government jobs, right? So that would be lots less money out in circulation. The other thing that I think is a potential problem with UBI, so on top of universal basic income, if you get rid of all the social programs in addition to it, which is what a lot of UBI advocates want to do, they want to get rid of all the social programs and just everyone just gets an automatic bank deposit. Then all they have to do, right, is just pick the most despicable person, just pick the most hateable person, child molesters, axe murderers, right? So in Alabama or Tennessee or Wisconsin, right? The local state legislature is saying, why should we give $1,000 a month to child molesters? And they got a point, right? No one wants to give any money to a child molester. That's our tax money. This guy molested a child. He got out of jail, and now he's getting $1,000 a month. And we don't want that, right? And so the state of Wisconsin or Indiana or Tennessee passes a law. No one ever convicted of, child molesting can get universal basic income. Which sounds good on the surface of it, except you have to remember they're not getting food stamps, they're not getting government assistance. So you have people who have no social safety net whatsoever, right? And once they do it to the child molester, then they do it to the person convicted of murder who gets out of prison, and then they do it to and then they do it to people convicted of any crime when they get out of prison. And then after that, they do it to people who said racist, sexist things on social media. And then they do it to, people who, you see, this could be very dangerous, right? If you set up a situation where there's only one means of social assistance, all you have to do is take that one means of social assistance away, and then the person has nothing, right? If it's only $1,000 a month, no government assistance, no food stamps, no Medicaid, nothing. Right? No. What is it? What do they give the mothers? I forget the name of the program where mothers get, they get like formula and stuff. None of that. You just get rid of all of that. Everyone just gets $1,000 a month bank deposit. No social programs other than that exist, right? Then all you have to do is then start to erode that, and at that point you've got all kinds of people who have nothing. And then you've got thousands of people on the street that are homeless. WIC, yeah, right, that's the name of the program. That's very dangerous. So there are some dangers with UBI. But overall, just having UBI, right, just everyone getting a $1,000 subsidy of their income is a good thing. I think it's a good thing. However, getting rid of all the other social programs, not a good thing. And that opens the door, and even UBI opens the door to some bad things. But overall, I think UBI is a good thing. But it still doesn't resolve the problem. The problem is capitalism. The problem is production organized for profit. It's not the lack of $1,000 every month. So it still doesn't address the basic problem. All right. What do you say to people who say communism killed 100 million people? Well, I say this, right? The number of people killed by capitalism, by the same standards, is incalculable, right? So, these numbers that they get, it's like there was a famine in the USSR in the 1930s, and there was. There was a famine in China during the Great Leap Forward in the early 60s. There was. I don't deny that, right? But according to these people, communism is responsible for all these people who died in a famine, okay? Right? If we're going to play that game. Everywhere the British Empire went in the 1800s had mass deaths and starvation. Everywhere, right? The British Empire, they went to China, right? And they had 2 opium wars to make sure China couldn't control its own economy. And when the British got control of China, they had a famine. Every couple of years they had a famine, right? There were some famines that hundreds of thousands of people died. Some famines, millions of people died. But from the time the British waged their opium wars and seized China up until 1949, all the time China had deaths of malnutrition. And that's just China, right? But so just in China, you're talking hundreds of millions of people dying because of capitalism, British capitalism controlling China. Then you got India, right? The British controlled India, right? The British East India Company, they didn't allow the people of India to have their own economy. They burned all their looms and textile mills, forced them to import their cloth. Gandhi, got arrested because he was trying to, boil water and make his own salt. No, you must buy your salt from the British. As a result of capitalist policies from the British Empire in India, there were all kinds of famines in which tens of millions of people died. So add those to it. Oh, and, there was this capitalist in Belgium, King Leopold, right, who was trying to make profits, right, capitalism, from rubber. And he set up these plantations that existed. And he worked, tens of millions of people to death in the Congo. So add that on there, right? Oh, then there was this thing called World War I. You ever heard of World War I? Well, that was major capitalist countries like the United States and France and Germany and Britain and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire had a big, huge war with each other for which capitalist controlled, the world economy. And 20 million people got sent to their deaths. So add another 20 million to capitalism's docket. All right, and, the United States, it was founded with the transatlantic slave trade. How many tens of millions of black Africans died on the Middle Passage trying to get to the United States so they could be worked for cheap labor for capitalist plantation owners? So add that in there. And how many Native Americans died when, the United States was seized from the Native Americans and the mass killing? Add that in there, right? And you can play this game. See, they never apply it fairly to communists, right? If you're going to play that game, that every famine that ever happened in China, ever happened in the USSR, every execution, every war that happened in the socialist countries is murder by communism. If you're going to play that game and you turn it around to capitalism, communism looks great because the death toll is way higher for capitalism, right? All the capitalist wars, all the capitalist famines, all the capitalist episodes of mass starvation, all the capitalist genocides, Latin America, right? The drug war in and of itself, right? The fact that in the 1980s, the United States armed and trained drug dealers and terrorists to fight against the Contras, or to fight against the socialist government of Nicaragua, the Sandinistas. That's still killing people. There's still a massive body count because those guns and those weapons that we handed over to the Contras, and they shipped cocaine into Los Angeles, and they were distributing cocaine across the United States, the drug dealers that were armed by this government, right? The the drug cartels have killed millions of people in Central America, right? Talk about Colombia, where the U.S. government has armed, paramilitaries to fight against the FARC, right? And those groups are involved in drugs and assassinations and killings. If you want to play this game, where, according to their logic, right, they get this big number based on all these things that have happened. If you apply that to capitalism, all of a sudden you get a body count. It's not even close. You get a body count that's like 10 times higher, right? The number of people who died because, the people who had low life expectancies because of capitalism, right? All over the developing world, the life expectancy of countries is very low compared to the West. Well, is that because of capitalism? Oh, well, then we'll add them to this. You would get a number, if you were to apply the standard that they apply to communists to get those numbers to capitalists, you would get a number that was so astronomically high, it would be ridiculous. That's what you have to say to these people. Don't play the game of it wasn't really that. They want you to sound like a Holocaust denier. See, and this is what they want. When they give you that big number, they want you to sit there and go, well, it wasn't that many million. And they say, oh, and I guess the Holocaust didn't happen too. That's like what Vosh does, because Vosh is just like these people, even though he calls himself a socialist. That's what they do, right? They give you these big numbers, right? And then they want you to quibble with them about the numbers so you sound like a neo-Nazi right-wing Holocaust denier. Don't do that. Just stay, okay, we'll accept your numbers, right? And now we apply it to capitalism, and you'll get the exact same logic, right? Because it is the way that they come up with these numbers is it's ridiculous. The way they come up with these numbers is they basically blame every bad thing that ever happened in China or Russia or Cuba or Venezuela, or they blame it all on communism, right? And that's not fair. That's not fair. It's not fair. But don't take the bait and start quibbling with them about numbers. They want you to do that because people are programmed. When they hear people quibbling about numbers, they go, aha, neo-Nazi. So don't do that, right? just don't do that, right? And don't argue with people about gulags, right? Gulags were camps. Nazis had camps. People associate the two in their minds. Gulags were not the same as Auschwitz, but you don't go there, right? Just don't go there because it's a trap, right? Just start pointing out, okay, we'll apply your logic to capitalism, and the whole thing falls apart. And then you'll get them, and this happened. I debated Stefan Molyneux. Go listen to that debate. He pulled that crap with me. And he just started insisting none of that was real capitalism. And that's what... All right, folks, I probably should start wrapping up. Should we pressure U.S. government to bring back manufacturing? Sure, demanding that the state start, employing people and hiring people, building national industries. That could be a demand. It's not socialism, but that's a demand. I mean, that's a good thing. That's a good thing to do, to demand that the government hire people to build infrastructure, to rebuild national industries, right? I mean, anything that will alleviate the suffering of the workers under capitalism is good, but it's not socialism, right? The answer is socialism. But any demand, that would be good. So this guy named Jesse says he wants to form a group of LGBT people that study the history of Marxism. Good for you. Good luck with that. That's a great thing. I actually learned a lot when, Leslie Feinberg wrote a series of articles called Lavender and Red, which was a history of the gay rights movement and the communist movement and where they intertwined. And that was a fascinating series of articles. A section of those articles was published as a history of Cuba. It was called Rainbow Solidarity in Defense of Cuba, but it's a much longer series. She talks about the Soviet Union and their issue of gay rights. She talks about Weimar Germany. She talks about, many different aspects of the relationship between communism and the gay rights movement. And I found that to be a very, very fascinating series of articles. I learned a lot about Harry Hay, about Joe McCarthy and how the McCarthyist witch hunt was also an anti-gay crackdown. It's really fascinating stuff. So there's a lot of interesting stuff you can learn from that history. Absolutely. A lot of stuff you can learn there. But folks, I think this has been a great live. I had a great time. I hope you thought the nice background was interesting. So I guess we'll just conclude the way we always do. Thank you, Space Communist. Thank you, G. We'll just conclude the way we always do. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. I'm out.